Alright, I am making the Urbit video now because I have noticed that people are starting to feel kind of anxiety over the way that the internet is run. It's run by a small set of internet plutocrats, I'd say. Now, the thing that really prompted this was this Brett Weinstein tweet that I saw, and it's really it's interesting because Brett Weinstein is perhaps the most inoffensive person on the internet. He's extremely boring. And it was the same for Jordan Peterson when that was a thing. All these IDW types are very boring. They don't say much that's like really out there. And for that reason, I mean, they stay like 2008 left-wing stuff. So when they get banned, it's an interesting indicator. And I actually saw Urbit in the replies to that tweet because there's kind of a zeitgeist right now of social media censorship is, I guess, the correct term. I'll show some clips of people expressing a kind of anxiety over this.
It's just not as fun anymore. Everything that all these people used to say about like free speech is finally coming true. All the interesting, funny, entertaining people have been eliminated. The prophecy has become true. And
this is like she has 1/10 the personality. She has 1/20 the personality of Scott Greer. Scott Greer is a king, and this lady is like trying to use targeted harassment policies against Scott Greer to get Scott Greer kicked off of Twitter.
Vote for Trump. Lakar told a Project Veritas journalist that playing God with Google users and YouTube made him uncomfortable, and he wants to leave Google. It doesn't jive with me. The journalist says, you guys own YouTube too, right? It says, we play God with that too. So why?
And really, they're not wrong. None of these sentiments are incorrect. There is a certain flaw with a very small set of internet plutocrats, internet timocrats, people with the special property of internet capital, having an interesting kind of control, an interesting amount of capital, an interesting kind of capital. In fact, speaking of that, I'd like to reference the book Capital as Power by Nietzsche and Bichler, who really go against both Marxist and neoclassical economics in saying that capital is neither an expression of utility nor abstract labor. Really, neither of those things exist. Capital is an expression of power, something really amenable to my reactionary post-liberal worldview. And, you know, in that sense, these companies are aggregating a greater and greater amount of power as they aggregate a greater and greater amount of capital. I mean, like in Peter Thiel's book 0 to 1, he discusses the insane profit margins that Google has. They have a lot of productive capital. And really, sort of like how the Italian elitists see gangs and mafias as mini-states, mini-governments cropping up under the protection of a larger government, these companies are really mini-governments as a result of that capital being just another expression of power. Mini-governments cropping up under the protection of these larger governments. The US government protects these people from, you know, their intellectual property being stolen. It gives them certain copyright protections. It does a lot. It gives them the capacity to lobby, right? So there's all this stuff, and they aggregate a lot of capital, a lot of power. Really, there's no distinction qua power in the government or power anywhere else. These are like mini-governments. You can think of them like that. And so what's really wrong with them having a lot of power? Obviously, we don't oppose power on that basis. We're not left-wing, we're not liberal, power's fine. But let's look back to Heidegger to see the real nature of these companies. Heidegger talks about technoscience, essentially, that science and technology are really two sides of the same coin. That, how do I phrase it? Technology changes the way we interact with the world, and science is us trying to grasp reality with this new technology. Science is us trying to control reality epistemologically as opposed to controlling reality physically, what technology does. And, you know, in some sense, obviously, since he believes that technology is ontologically prior to science, in some sense that's obvious, right? Observation is a predicate for science, and to observe precisely, you need tools, so that's obvious, but it's more than that. Heidegger sees technology as ontologically prior to science. He sees science as the same kind of thing as technology, but one predicated on technology, which I would say is correct. And in those terms, in the terms of science being an attempt at controlling the epistemological framework after technology gives you a new way to control some other system in reality, then these social media platforms and these internet giants are really a kind of science. They are an attempt to take a technology, the internet, the World Wide Web, all those different things that developed out around the 90s, and to make them conform to another frame, to a different epistemological frame, to take this really unbounded, very unusual technology and make it usual, exert control over it, which we'll see is kind of a big issue. I mean, exerting control over this technological breakthrough is sort of an issue. Like, consider Endeavor's video about the woke basin superstructure. These people are very, very subject to the cathedral, and we'll get to that in a moment, but these people who have this sort of control are conforming the new internet mediation, the new social mediation that the internet brings around, in ways that I don't think are very good, and we'll see why there's flaws with them, not just, politically, but also just structurally. And these are not the right people to have this power. This is a totally random assignment of power. This is an extreme amount of control to have, an extreme amount of capital to have control over. I mean, like, aristocracy is ancient Greek for the best, the most virtuous having power. And I think it's really the opposite here. I mean, are the people who do content moderation on Twitter the best? Are the fact checkers that they choose the best? Is, Snopes, factcheck.org, are those, like, good quality websites? Good quality people? Twitter, like, all these companies, Twitter, Reddit, etc., when it's in their hands to do this massive content moderation, they're not the right people to be doing it. Really, nobody is right to be doing it, because content moderation is really not an important thing. When you're a platform, you're supposed to give, like, an equal baseline. Again, this isn't democracy, this is aristocracy. You want the best to have power, so you allow the best to draw eyes to the platform, but as it is now, it's more like a kakocracy. It's like the worst having power. That would be ancient Greek for the worst having power. So, and I want to change that. I want to change the system as it is now away from these, like, Silicon Valley, anemic Palo Alto people having this insane amount of control to the best having power, which really, to do that, you need a kind of a baseline. You need an even baseline where people don't get banned for wrongthink, where people don't get banned erroneously. I mean, like Brett Weinstein getting banned, that's completely erroneous. He's not boring, he's not threatening to anybody. These people are extremely pareidolik in who they consider dangerous. There's a sort of overexcited pattern matching and word association in their minds with who is dangerous and has scary ideas and is too heterodox. So that's a big issue. You want an even baseline so that there can be a real aristocracy, that is to say, so that the best can have power. So we've seen attempts to get rid of the system as it is now. We've seen these alternative media attempts, and really they all failed. Gab, Parler, Minds, they all failed. They all suck. ThinkSpot too. They're component for component remakes of the system as it is presently, and that'll never really go anywhere. The system as it is presently sucks, and even if it didn't suck, if you're making a component for component remake, you're at a permanent disadvantage. Twitter has already done that. Gab copying Twitter means they're at a permanent disadvantage. Reddit has already done that. Snapchat has already done that. If you want to make, like, racist Twitter, then you're always just going to be worse Twitter, and furthermore, you're going to have a monoculture. You're not going to have any real good contention. Part of the way that these companies get interesting, part of the reason that Twitter is like a good source for discussion online, is like an interesting place, is because there's interesting people on it and people who disagree with one another. Whereas on Gab, everyone agrees. It's like based racist 1488 and Dugan Respecter 1352. Hashing it out on why Varg isn't racist enough or something. That's not interesting. That purity spiral bullshit, that's part of what destroyed Tumblr. And Gab is really like Tumblr for right-wing people. It's insanely boring. So, there's flaws there. There's flaws with just copying the system as it is now. And the fact that this has been tried again and again and has never worked has made people jaded in a lot of senses. Like, I'll play a clip from Nick Fuentes right now.
And it's not even that. That's the tip of the iceberg. But then try to go and step off of YouTube and make your own platform. Try to step off of Facebook or Twitter or Reddit and make your own platform. Try and make your own alternative. Good luck with that. You've seen the hurdles that we've run into time and time again with alternative tech. Then you can't find a payment processor. Then you can't find a domain registrar. Then you can't find, whatever particular service it is, video hosting, streaming, whatever it is, then you're not able to find that service.
And you can see that there's not a lot of promise over this anymore. People don't feel that positive about the idea of an alternative media source. In fact, Nick runs away to the idea that you have to legislate what's there now. And there's problems with that. I'd suggest that the one issue with legislation is that it's not happening. And the second issue is that if a new technology comes around, as I'll say is inevitable, then it's inevitably going to take all the people, the cathedral, who moderate the current system, it's going to be their refuge. And that's a problem that you don't want to have to deal with. So, there's some issues. Gab, Parler Minds, ThinkSpot, they're the same as every other website. They're not technically superior. They're a monoculture. They're not fun to be on. Everyone there is boring. But we forget, there are successful websites that have a kind of free speech environment. There's 4chan, there was 8chan before that got taken off. And they're really structurally different, which is why they don't really come to mind when you think of social media. Really, 4chan's not a social media site, but there are at least places to engage with people that have that kind of environment of free speech behind them. Now, that's not to say that the structure of 4chan is at all similar to the structure of Gab, Twitter, Reddit, Snapchat, any of those. It's a different thing structurally, which I think is important to provide a successful and convincing alternative, to have a structural difference, an organizational difference. And it wasn't built for that, which makes it surprising as to why 4chan is so long-lasting and it has this sort of reputation. I mean, a lot of people don't know this. They think it's a lot older than these websites, but Facebook was released in 2004. 4chan was released in 2003. They're not that old, or they're not that different in terms of age. So it's interesting that one has lasted a lot longer because one has a much more definitive community. One is a lot less subject to the perfect competition there is in social media right now, because 4chan's really not social media. So keep that in mind. To replace social media, you almost have to transcend social media. And, well, let's look at how we avoid the Gab, Parler, Minds, ThinkSpot thing, the sort of Gavin McInnes free speech network thing, the boring free speech social media network, and how we get over to that systematic rewriting, the fact that 4chan is able to paradigmatically shift to an extent the way that people interact, and thereby provide an actual convincing alternative to these websites. Well, in one sense, you have to think bigger. Because Twitter, Snapchat, Reddit, Discord, they're all derivations on the same business model. They attract consumer eyes and they sell them, either as data or as advertiser viewers. And they get money from that, and they get eyes from that. A consequence of money and attention is control. I mean, in Bertrand de Juvenel's definition of power, it's pretty much shared attentionality. It's pretty much being the center of shared attention. And Twitter, Snapchat, Reddit, etc., they are definitionally the center of shared attention. Twitter controls what trends, Twitter controls who's allowed on their platform. Snapchat bans certain news from their news tab, which is how they make money, interestingly. Reddit maintains and promotes certain politics communities and bans others. Discord does something similar to all of those. That's an insane amount of control, and it's an example of that content moderation as a consequence of capital. Capital is power, and they get content moderation, a sort of superstructural power, out of that. And again, inefficient allocation. These people are the most subject to the cathedral. For reference, what the cathedral is, for the uninitiated, is essentially when church-going started to decrease after the Cold War, there was this Protestant sort of moral vacuum. The nomos and ethos of Protestantism were still in the air, but nobody was filling that power vacuum. No one was filling that gap. And then all these different institutions, Hollywood, the media, all these different groups started to fill it up, and they are called the cathedral now. It's a very powerful term, and you can see they engage in very specific sorts of propaganda, very specific sorts of social engagement. They're an interesting force, and they have a strong grasp on the internet because the people who run these companies, Twitter, Snapchat, Reddit, etc., are very subject to the cathedral. I mean, what's the kind of person who lives in Palo Alto? What kind of person lives in San Francisco? They're very subject to that, and not only that, but there is a degree of explicit miscegenation between the ADL, the SPLC, and Reddit and Twitter. You'll notice the ADL and SPLC, these political propagandism organizations, they do in fact provide basically social media guidelines that are non-binding, but all these companies pretty much mirror them. All these companies will hear that, and they're in a sort of moral competition. So to show what I mean, let's say that Twitter and Reddit They make more strictly anti-right-wing hate speech, like terms and conditions, hate speech community guidelines stuff, and Discord doesn't, well then it's going to start to become news that Discord is the hateful organization. And this actually did happen, pretty much. There were all these concern-trolling media organizations that were basically falsely saying that Discord is like Wignat, alt-right, breeding ground, and they got a lot of people concerned about it, which reinforces this sort of base and superstructure. The base, Twitter, Snapchat, Reddit, Discord, need to keep the superstructure alive, and the superstructure themselves kind of maintain the base. It works in a cyclical relationship around this moral issue. Of course, not literally the Marxist base and superstructure. We're using very different meaning here, but the same terminology. So, as a consequence, they get a lot of control, they're very subject to the cathedral, and one of the reasons that the cathedral really need this is because as the internet gets bigger and bigger for social engagement, it's the cathedral's only hope. Imagine if the cathedral only had Hollywood. Imagine if they only had legacy media. That would suck for them. They would have a large contingent of young people who are getting exposed to ideas that are not just propaganda of the system. And this started happening for a while. Between around 2003 and 2012, there started to be independent people giving philosophical, political, religious information that was outside of the bounds of what the cathedral considers acceptable, of what the cathedral enjoys. And this was a big issue, and perhaps coincidentally around that time you start to see people that are in the cathedral start to take a much stronger grasp on these Web 2.0 companies like Facebook, Twitter, etc. If they were secure, think of it like this, their propaganda wouldn't be necessary. Going back to that meme, if the cathedral didn't need to propagandize, they wouldn't. They do have to propagandize, so they do. And what that means is they really rely on the internet, which means changes in the internet are a big threat to them. And in fact, the thing that I'll propose, Urbit, in the early days of Urbit, there was a lot of news that was calling Urbit, like, dangerous. It was made by Moldbug. Isn't Moldbug the evil anti-democracy racist? So there was all this concern trolling, and I bet, here's some advice. That concern trolling for Urbit is going to get bigger and bigger, and when you start to see it ramp up, that's when you should buy an ID, because it's going to start getting big when people start, getting their panties in a twist over it. But, returning back, it's the cathedral's only hope that there is this internet, and that there are a very small set of internet plutocrats that allow them to have control and that are very subject to them. So, let's look at how we fix this. Let's look at how the internet shifted at once, because it did at once shift, or at least social engagement shifted with the internet. Let's look at that change and see if we could do it again. How do these companies get user eyes? How do they get user attention, consumer eyes? They get it through user interaction, right? It's fun to talk with people, especially when they disagree with you. And that's a big thing on Twitter. There were blood sports all over YouTube for a while. There's still a big debate sphere on YouTube. All this stuff is very important. And, they don't supply it perfectly. There's a lot of flaws in their methodology for the user interaction, but they're pretty much the only place to get it in an interesting way, so they're very big. And, of course, you see there are successful alternatives again, namely 4chan. 4chan is much less centralized, but they still have just as much more interesting, really, user interaction. There's a lot more interesting stuff on 4chan because it is completely decentralized. There's not even users. You can't even make an account on 4chan. For the uninitiated, it's completely anonymous for everybody on the platform. The only degree of centralization is category centralization. Like, there's specific communities, specific boards on 4chan. But they're much less centralized, and they have just as much user interaction, which is very interesting. That decentralization will be important in a moment, and I'll explain why. So, really, they do benefit from that level of decentralization because power emerges naturally. Again, this is not democracy. I will never pay lip service to democracy. This is aristocracy, the rule of the best, because this is a system where the best can get popular, where the best ideas, not even the best people, but the best ideas proliferate strongly through these communities. That's why you see, Pol shifted radically. Back in the day on 4chan, Pol and B were completely different communities. They were libertarian and left-wing. Look at them today. Now B is porn, but before B was just porn, they had a very different atmosphere from how they did when 4chan was a young website. And that's because the best ideas naturally survive in a completely free speech environment. So now we have these useful concepts. We have concepts of free speech as a sort of palingenesis, as a way to give an equal baseline so the best ideas get to the top. We see that a little bit of decentralization is nice, or complete decentralization is nice, and that bigger solutions are better solutions. 4chan is a much broader sort of an alternative than Gab is. Gab is an alternative pretty much only to Twitter, but 4chan subsumes the entirety of elements of Reddit, of Twitter, etc., even of like Tumblr. They subsume complete elements of that system, and they maintain all of the useful consequences of them, which is user interaction. That is to say, you can make a really big solution that keeps all of the good qualities, while, as a consequence of it being a bigger solution, allowing yourself to replace this legacy big tech stuff. So now we have these useful ideas for things that help to bite at the ankles of big tech and eventually overtake them. Again, they propagandize about this because they have to. They say that, like, 4chan is the dangerous incel QAnon, dangerous racist QAnon. This is YouTube, so I can't say that name neutrally, but they say that 4chan is this evil website because they have to. If they don't, they lose a strong contingent of people. 4chan's been growing continuously for 17 years now. If, say, the feds didn't take down 8chan, that would be another problem. They had to say that dangerous terrorism was going on, so we're going to take the whole website down as a way to get around that. And this brings us to a little bit of a problem. Despite how decentralized 4chan and 8chan are in terms of user interaction, they're inherently centralized because the internet is inherently centralized. Remember VDare? VDare almost got taken down. VDare, the DNS of VDare, they almost weren't allowed to have that name because their domain registrar threatened to take them down for having right-wing ideas. Very, very strong level of centralization there. It's a single fault point. You see this in a smaller sense, again, within the communities. Nick Fuentes gets taken off YouTube, Alex Jones gets taken off everywhere. Tons of these people are getting banned as a way to, grasp at the last section of power that the cathedral has. But imagine a system where it was impossible to ban people, right? Imagine a system where it was impossible to ban people and it wasn't just a boring remake of all of these systems. That is to say, imagine a whole internet where it was impossible to ban people. That would be kind of interesting. You could have a Facebook, you could have a Twitter, you could have a Snapchat, you could have all of this, but you imagine a sort of structure, that is to say, that was not conducive to banning people. To ban someone, you would need to do something very circuitous. You see this in some things on the internet. This is kind of how the internet used to be to an extent, but you can never ban people from email, right? You can block someone, but you can never ban somebody from email, because that's just not how that system works. The protocol is completely kinda peer-to-peer. So if you were to ban someone, you would need the SMTP server to ban them. Never gonna happen. So that's interesting. The more peer-to-peer your system is, the more difficult it is to ban somebody. Take this all the way. The peer-to-peer file sharing network, like LimeWire back in the day, imagine trying to ban someone off LimeWire. That doesn't even make sense as a concept. Imagine trying to ban someone off uTorrent or BitTorrent. That doesn't work as a concept because they are completely peer-to-peer. But they're peer-to-peer in a very limited way. They're peer-to-peer insofar as they share data, they share files, they share like music and stuff. But that's not a lot. There's not a lot of stuff there. It's very limited, and it's not a real alternative to what exists on the internet right now, obviously. It's structurally nice. It's structurally interesting insofar as you cannot ban people. But imagine that peer-to-peer decentralization transposed onto an entire internet. A layer of the internet where it was impossible to ban people. No domain registrar could take you off. No website could take you down. You could never get, like, shadow banned through the algorithm on a website. Well, to do that, to expand that peer-to-peer system to the whole internet, you would need a peer-to-peer networking system, which is not a terribly difficult idea to think of. It might be slow, but it's not very difficult to think of. The only flaw in the internet as it is now is you would need some sort of a single identity so that people don't make a million alt accounts. Right now, you usually use your phone if you need two-factor authentication to prove you are who you say you are. Like CSGO does that. On CSGO, you use your phone to show that you're definitely who you say you are, because to make another alt account, then you would need to pay for a SIM card. You would need to pay like $40 to get that new phone number and activate it. So tying it to something you have to pay for is the way that you get those definite centers of truth in who somebody is, so that there's not a million alt accounts. That would be the only predicate for this networking system to exist. If you get a good ID system where you know someone's who they say they are, and you make some kind of a networking system that is secure, relatively fast, and completely peer-to-peer, it would be impossible to ban people. It would be impossible to filter this algorithm. The only way to connect with somebody would be to run a program on your machine. Very different from Twitter. To go onto Twitter, you ask Twitter for their website. You send your information to Twitter, and in response, they give you their algorithm, which tells you what posts are there, which shows you a list of posts that they deem good for you. When you post to Twitter, you ask for permission to post your tweet, and then it goes into their algorithm, and hypothetically, someone might see it. Of course, if you're shadow banned, they won't. So, kind of interesting, right? There's this degree of centralization and indirection in Twitter that would be impossible on this networking system. Yet, this other networking system, the peer-to-peer system, would have the capacity to completely replace everything that's on the internet right now. In fact, because it would all be integrated by means of it being a single networking system, it would be easier to make these different social media systems. You wouldn't have to make a separate Twitter, Reddit, and Discord account. It would all be one thing. You could easily switch between them. Whoever's the developers could make it much more quickly, much more rapidly. You could integrate the software much more easily with one another. There's a lot of benefits there, and it fixes that big superstructural flaw, basically a bug in social media as it is now, the center of power, the fact that there's a couple opaque content moderators who can ban, force people off their platforms, destroy the algorithm such that like right-wing views are no longer prominent, so that, like, you know, you supplant Nick Fuentes with Vosh so that people have safe ideas, or more likely you supplant Nick Fuentes with Jordan Peterson so that people have at least safe ideas. That would not be possible because on this networking system, on an entirely peer-to-peer system, you get data completely in a decentralized way. Nobody can be banned, nobody can change the algorithm. I'm really trying to hammer that into your head because it's so structurally different. It feels impossible to make that, right? It feels like, and I'm sure you know where I'm going with this, that identity system and networking system that's necessary, the single source of truth, which isn't just your phone number, and the completely peer-to-peer networking system does exist. It's Urbit. That is what Urbit is. Conceptually, it's just that networking system and identity. Now, it also has like an operating system, it has all this other stuff so that it at least has some usability before people start making third-party software for it. But Urbit has that superior identity system. You pay a certain amount of money to get one of a limited amount of identities, which are basically a cryptographic key, and once you have that key, you can log on. If you were to make a social media site on Urbit, there would be no need for signing in because that identity is the single source of truth. I've heard it phrased like Urbit IDs are digital land, just like Bitcoin is digital money, and I don't really like that comparison, but it's useful for the concept. Your ID would also work as the domain name for a website that you make on Urbit, because Urbit, again, can host websites. There's not really a good reason for Bitcoin to exist, but there's a very good reason for Urbit to exist. Dethroning centralized currency, that's difficult. That's a bigger goal that Bitcoin can't solve in and of itself. But the internet as it is now is very liable to be replaced by Urbit. Again, there are 4chans, there are alternative sources that are getting big, there are alternative sources that are very appealing, they just get taken off every now and then. Remember, 8chan got taken down. Urbit is completely peer-to-peer, so to take Urbit down would require the same technology as, say, taking Bitcoin down. It doesn't make sense. But yeah, Urbit has that central identification system, which is very important, and bigger, much bigger, they have that networking system, a completely decentralized peer-to-peer network. If you make something, if you are someone on Urbit, it's never going to get taken down. It's secure because there's encryption at play, but it's never going to get taken down like, again, 8chan did. It's never going to get taken down like VDare was threatened to. This is partially because on a peer-to-peer system, every program runs on your system. Like I was saying, that indirection with Twitter, where you go to Twitter for permission to see what other people have posted, and you post to Twitter for other people to be able to see it through Twitter's algorithm, That's not how it is on Urbit, since everything runs on your system. Nobody, for that reason, can sell your data. Nobody is or can sell your eyes or data because, as it is now, all the programs run on your system. You don't contact anyone else. It's entirely peer-to-peer. And another consequence of that, another non-obvious immediate consequence of that, is that people can't just, rent-seeking, power-hungry, ankle-biting people can't just get power. It can't just fall into the wrong hands. For an example of that, look at Steve Franson talk about Nina Jankovic.
Without greater regulation on a federal level, or
Yes, this woman wants to regulate.
more cooperation that is.
You hurt my feelings. I'm gonna send thugs after you with guns and badges.
Reach out to those people, and there is, a certain extent of.
This lady is an internet abuser.
There's always going to be people who believe in conspiracy theories.
She can't even engage the arguments.
Whether they're on the internet or, before the internet existed, those folks always existed, and perhaps we should be reaching out to the more average folks, not the ones who are on the
Oh, yeah, through the CIA movies, right?
fringes. But as we've seen, that sort of behavior increasingly
She just needs to control other people.
is able to migrate.
She's such a hard-on for trying to control other people using government.
This is a very negative personality type for the internet, obviously, the need to have this control, the need to have constant fact-checking, the need to have Snopes on every article, the need to keep the New York Post off of Twitter. A kind of personality that cannot thrive on Urbit because that sort of behavior is literally impossible in a peer-to-peer framework. It would be like demanding that someone take their torrent down. To do that, for someone to take their torrent down, to force them, you need to go to their server and disable it, right? Imagine if you had that level of security on Twitter. Imagine if to ban you off Twitter, they had to go to Twitter HQ or go to your house and get your account to be deleted, either physically or on your end. That would make these power-hungry people a lot more recalcitrant when it comes to these broader networks. Right now, they feel very powerful. These people in the cathedral feel huge, but there's ways around it. And furthermore, again, every program runs on your system. Your data is yours. Nobody's selling it. It's decentralized. You can't get banned. The algorithm's not lying to you. None of these rent-seeking jagoffs can get power because, again, it's decentralized. But furthermore, it is all integrated. This is more nerdy. This is more of a thing close to my heart because back in the day, I would play with all these heterodox operating systems like Plan 9 and Temple OS. And for as underdeveloped and archaic as they were, something about the system being designed all at once and having a holistic environment in mind means that you can do like cool stuff. Like on Temple OS, you can put an image in a text document that you click, which opens up a program, which is a game, and that program itself can link to other stuff. If it were a better operating system, it could link to stuff like the internet. Plan 9 has something similar. It's more complicated, and I don't want to launch into it because this is not a pure software channel, but that level of integration where different programs can kind of like seamlessly engage with other ones is kind of nice to feel. Urbit has this right now, and it's embedded in the whole system since those identities exist on the network. Nobody can take them down, which is a big benefit, but since they exist on the network, you can have these communities that transcend each of the programs currently on Urbit. Right now, Urbit has a blogging program, a Reddit replacement sort of a thing, and a chat Discord replacement sort of a thing. Those are the three programs that exist, but when you make a community, you can make channels on the chat, you can make different blogs, you can make different link aggregators like Reddit, all within that one community. There's a level of integration. Imagine if a Discord server weren't just a Discord server, but it also connected to a central Twitter account, a central subreddit, all that stuff. It would be very, very weird, but it would also allow you to have much less opaque communities where you can follow people around a lot easier on different data. You don't need to have this like god-awful verification system that Twitter has. And hey, that's another way to reduce centralization. Remember, Milo Yiannopoulos got his Twitter verification taken away from him. That whole verification system, that whole like centralization of identity is completely gone on Urbit. And furthermore, you can follow these people around anywhere. They don't need that verification because on every website they have the same ID. On every program, I should say, they have the same identity. Right now, there are Urbit communities that I'm on, like the Collapse and Urbit community itself, which are, multiple different sorts of these websites, right? There is a Reddit-ish component. There is a chat Discord-ish component. There is a blog-ish component to all of these. But they all exist within one community, which feels pretty cool. I'm going to show some examples on the screen as I talk about it. This also means that, as I said before, new networks and new programs can be made a lot quicker and can communicate with one another in a way that they really can't right now. And while this isn't big to people who aren't developers, on the user end, what that means is when new programs start to get made for Urbit, a lot more stuff is going to start coming out. It's not going to be like it takes a year to make every single advancement, because every advancement will build off the previous ones. It's all on one network. And finally, this is maybe the biggest thing. This is not in the network, but it is in Urbit as a social entity. It's not a monoculture. Very big. Gab, Parler, Minds, they're all these very boring monocultures where everyone's just boring and right-wing. Maybe they're libertarian, maybe they're like Nazis, but they're all right-wing and there's no real contention. It's just purity spiraling. Urbit is not like that. Urbit has a weird programmer community. The way that Hacker News, the way that early Reddit, the way that early 4chan did. Which I think foretell of a growing platform, right? I mean, on the internet, which do you want? Do you want to be boring and purity spiralish, or do you want to be weird and programmerish and nerdish? I prefer the weird side. And if you are to look at the networks that grew big, they all grew big after having began with a sort of weird heterodox nucleus, a heterodox nucleus that were the first people on the platform. I hypothesize that's because they're fun to talk to. That's because there's more variation. There's no purity spiraling. And that's how it is on Urbit right now. It's not just a monoculture. It has that antecedent of a strong community that's not just like the Tumblr, that's not just like right-wing Tumblr. And there's communities which let you miscegenate out those different, the based racists can have their own community. Kind of like on Telegram. Telegram is not as bad as Gab and stuff because they all segregate into different areas. So there's at least a level of separation there. Urbit has that. Of course, Urbit is much bigger and is difficult to compare to any of these because Urbit is really like another internet. It's not really like a website. It's not a website. It really is a whole other internet. The relationship between the internet and phone lines is the same as the relationship between Urbit and the internet. The internet used existing safe technology and infrastructure to make something much bigger, and Urbit does the same, just to the internet. That's the relationship you should have in your head. So it's difficult to compare them, but that community is not the same, and it has the potential to grow in a much safer way that doesn't get boring and samey, the way that Gab, all those websites do. So really, there's a lot of benefits to Urbit, one of which being that it already exists, right? Urbit exists as it is now, and stuff can be built on it, and that's huge. But where do we go from here? Well, there's a couple programs, as I mentioned before. There's Chat, which is a text chat thing, kind of like Discord. There is Publish, which is basically a blogging network. And there's Links. And there's Links, which is like Reddit, like a link aggregator, but without any upcomies, which is a big benefit. It's like social media without the upvotes and downvotes, which is cooler. It's better. I don't know why everyone needs those upcomies. It's just a way to get advertisers to have more power. Urbit is very, very decentralized, which is nice. And it's getting bigger and bigger. In the works right now is a complete Twitter clone. Not like complete clone component for component, but a clone of the functionality of Twitter that runs on Urbit. Over the course of around 4 years, Urbit has gone from borderline unusable to where it is now, which is extremely promising. They just recently did a UI overhaul that I think looks way better, and there's a lot of programs in the works. I should also mention that a certain guy who knows right-wing philosophy, he's based, but he hides it, and a friend of Elon Musk, I'm not going to say who, but he's an important guy, sank $6 million into Urbit. For reference, he was, I think, the second investor in Facebook as well. So there are people that aren't in this right-wing Twitter sphere that recognize the potential of Urbit and are investing into it. There are people that are interested in this technology, which is completely decentralized and has the potential to dethrone Twitter, and is, again, impossible to legislate. A big thing that I feel like is important to have in your mind. You cannot legislate Urbit. If Twitter were right-wing, a right-wing hegemony, the way it is currently a left-wing hegemony, that would be a big problem because Urbit would be super hopeful for the cathedral. The cathedral would be like, oh, there's this network that's completely decentralized. we can't get a lot of control, but we can at least flood it, and the government can't legislate it. So really, there's a degree of promise in the fact that it's totally decentralized and no one can interfere with it, not even the government. Again, the government interfering with Urbit would be like the government interfering with Bitcoin. That concept doesn't make sense. So we have all this promise in there right now, and there's enough in Urbit for it to be a nice ecosystem as it is now, but we need to make more. I know how to make programs on Urbit now. I've recently learned, and I'm going to start doing that. Right now, again, in the works, there's a functional Twitter replacement right there. There are hackathons on Urbit too, which means that there are sort of sprints of new technology being developed. Soon, there will be the capacity for a peer-to-peer live streaming system. When the network is fast enough, I want to start making content that allows for video sharing on Urbit. I think that's going to be big. But for now, that stuff's not there. We have a blog, a Reddit, and a Discord sort of a thing right now. So I recommend that people use it. You can use it for free on a deprivileged identity that shows as being free. And if you want a permanent ID, you can buy one for $20. I would recommend you only do that when it's worth it. Right now, Urbit is just brewing, but eventually it's going to be a big contender for all of these different social media, all these different networking things. I recommend you just get a public free identity for now, but check it out, because it's epic and it's cool and it's king shit, okay? Censorship resistant, as I said before, I am there at Narmal Hochtel, so contact me there. It's a big thing. Hey, big and getting bigger. I think October was their biggest month ever in terms of user growth, and it's getting bigger and bigger, and they have great user retention too. So check it out. It's epic. I made the Urbit video. This was the Urbit video, so thank you. And cheers. And cheers. Music.